Today we're diving into the world of Swiss Meringue Buttercream. This is a silky smooth, super popular frosting that's traditionally made by mixing a whipped meringue with softened butter. Now the key word here is traditionally, because I'm going to offer you some unique perspectives that build on the idea of Swiss Meringue Buttercream. It's going to make it easier and more efficient, which in turn makes it more beginner friendly. And in my opinion, I think it tastes a little bit better. You'll want to use Swiss Meringue Buttercream for these reasons. It is incredibly silky and creamy soft. Most people who find buttercreams too heavy often like this one as it has a melt in your mouth texture. You prefer a less sweet frosting. This one leans more butter forward with just enough sweetness to balance. You need a super polished finish. It spreads and smooths effortlessly, making it a favorite for beginners and pro cake decorators alike. So today we're gonna break a few rules. Whether you're here to learn some new techniques or you really like the classic version and you wanna stick with that one, in either case, you're gonna walk away from this video with a much deeper understanding so that you get a perfect Swiss Meringue Buttercream every time. Now, before we dive into my method, here's a quick look at how classic Swiss Meringue Buttercream is made, and that's so you know where we're headed. For the ingredients, I'll just need some fresh egg whites, white granulated sugar, unsalted butter, and a little bit of vanilla and salt for flavoring. Very simply, a Swiss Meringue Buttercream needs two components. First, you have the meringue, which is the egg whites and the sugar, and the second is the butter. And then you just mix those two components together. The classic method starts by gently heating fresh egg whites and sugar until the sugar dissolves and the mixture reaches a safe temperature, around 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And this kills any disease-causing bacteria. This step also helps denature or unfold the egg proteins, which improves their ability to whip up. Then the syrup mixture is whipped into a glossy, stiff meringue. It's crucial that there's no trace of fat in the bowl because yolks and things like that will interfere with the protein's ability to trap air. Then softened butter is gradually mixed in using the paddle attachment, which helps maintain a smooth and stable emulsion. So usually in this part of the video, I cover a bit of science, but since there are a few variations that you can make, I'd like to cover the base method first, or the how. And undoubtedly, you're gonna have some questions along the way. I will address those, or the why, at the end of the video. Okay, for the ingredients for my version of Swiss Meringue Buttercream, we only need one additional ingredient, and that's powdered sugar. And the general workflow is gonna be the same. We're gonna make a meringue and then we're gonna add it to butter. So the first step is to find a pot that allows a large bowl to sit on top. Then you're gonna fill that pot with water so it's within about an inch of the bottom of your bowl, but you don't want the bowl to sit directly in the water. Then I'm going to add the egg whites and the sugar to that heat-proof mixing bowl, and I'm gonna stir that with a spatula until the sugar is evenly distributed. Once the double boiler is at a gentle simmer, I'm gonna go ahead and place that bowl on top and use a spatula to stir periodically until the egg syrup reaches 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, once that meringue syrup has reached the final temperature, I'll then remove it from the double boiler and just set that aside to cool. I need it to be at or around room temperature for the next step. For step 3, I'm gonna ensure that the butter temperature is around 60 to 70. You don't need a thermometer for this, but if you can push a whisk pretty easily through the butter, that means that it's ready. Then I add the butter to the mixing bowl and whisk on high speed for about 3 to 5 minutes, scraping down the sides at least once. Aerated butter will be paler and slightly more voluminous. After that, I'm going to add the powdered sugar, vanilla extract, and a small pinch of salt. I'm gonna mix on high for another 2 to 3 minutes. For step 4, I'm gonna make sure that that egg syrup is at room temperature. If it's too hot, it's gonna melt that butter. So I do need it to be relatively cool. And I'm going to add it to the butter in around 3 to 5 additions, whipping for about 1 minute after each addition. Once all the egg syrup has been added, I'm going to mix for an additional minute on high speed. And the last step is to switch over to the paddle attachment because the whisk introduced lots of air pockets and I want to smooth everything out to help with my decorating. I'm also going to taste the buttercream here and adjust for salt and vanilla. The final buttercream will be silky smooth with a melted in your mouth texture, and it is now ready to frost your cakes or store for later. Okay, did you notice any differences between the classic version and my newly updated Swiss meringue buttercream? So in this part of the video, I'm gonna cover 3 insights that I've come up with about Swiss meringue buttercream. It's gonna go into why it functions the way that it does, and hopefully spark a little bit of creativity in your baking. The first insight that I have, and probably the most obvious, is that Swiss meringue buttercream does not require the meringue to be aerated or whipped. So this came up as I was making Swiss meringue buttercream one time, and as it happens often, the meringue wouldn't whip up, likely due to extra fat in the bowl, just remained kind of liquid. And instead of throwing the meringue out, I just kept going with the buttercream. And I found that the buttercream was nearly identical in taste, texture, flavor to a buttercream that used a whipped meringue. So I tested this out by measuring the aeration percentage of 2 different types of buttercream. One with a whipped meringue and one with a unwhipped or syrupy meringue. And what I found is that the aeration percentage between the 2 were nearly identical, which led me to believe that the meringue is really not contributing much in the aeration department. And if you're wondering how I come up with these percentages, it's a common question. I measure what's called the overrun. An overrun is a measurement of how big something gets in terms of volume when you add air. It's a pretty common measurement in ice cream manufacturing because it'll tell them how light or dense the final product is. And the more I thought about this, the more it makes sense. If you think about a meringue is a foam, which means there are air bubbles dispersed throughout this medium, the medium being a sugary liquid. And in that sugary liquid, you have strands of egg white proteins that form this net. They connect with each other, and that's what's holding, well, they kind of surround the air bubbles and, this complex network, okay? And they surround and hold these air bubbles in place. That's how the meringue can hold so much air. When you add fat in the form of butter, like if you're making a buttercream, the fat competes with the proteins on the surface of the air bubbles. And so it kind of pushes the proteins off. And at the same time, it also prevents the proteins from sticking to each other as efficiently. And so the net kind of collapses. And in doing so, the air bubbles pop and the foam collapses. So you'll see this if you make a Swiss meringue buttercream. You'll start with a super fluffy meringue. As you start to add in softened butter, there's a marked decrease in the volume of the meringue. There's air loss, essentially. So can we even call it Swiss meringue buttercream? We're not technically whipping up a meringue. I don't quite know what I would call it. That's why I have a separate category of frostings, which I call the sugarology frostings. Those are based on a sugar syrup that gets mixed into butter. And this is very similar. It's a meringue syrup because it contains egg white proteins, and that gets mixed into butter. Although I don't know if I would actually classify it as that same type of buttercream. So I'm kind of up in the air about that. And aside from the semantics of it all, I think the more important thing to take away from this is that in general, aeration in frostings is actually quite low. My measurements are showing anywhere from the 2 to 20% range. Now, the good news about this insight is that if you encounter the problem where you're trying to whip up your meringue and it's just not working, don't throw away your meringue. You can still use it. You can use my frosting butter technique and whip up the butter and then add the liquid meringue, or you can just add softened butter into your deflated meringue, and I promise you will still end up with a very delicious frosting. This brings me to my second insight, in that Swiss meringue buttercream's aeration is more affected by the butter. So this observation came about because I was trying to solve another problem, and that bakers were telling me that no matter what they did, their buttercreams, including this one, would be overly buttery in terms of flavor and very thick on the palate. So I developed a preconditioning method where you add a very precise amount of powdered sugar to the butter. And what this does is break up the butter fat, and this leads to a final buttercream that doesn't feel and taste overly buttery. And I found that in this step, by adding those tiny little sugar crystals, I'm also aerating the butter a little bit. So I tested some frostings both with whipped meringue and with meringue syrup and added added butter that had been pre-conditioned, and I found that the aeration of the butter went up by a couple percent. Now that might seem small, but you could definitely taste and feel the difference between the buttercreams. The ones made with the frosting butter were less fatty, and they were definitely lighter and silkier on the palate. Okay, now that we know that butter is doing most of the heavy lifting for us and that we don't need to aerate the meringue, this brings me to my third and final insight, and that is Swiss meringue buttercream is not limited to just raw egg whites. And a question I often get is, can you use pasteurized or carton egg whites in Swiss meringue buttercream? And I think because carton egg whites often don't whip up as efficiently, or they don't whip up at all compared to raw egg whites, therefore they can't be used in a Swiss meringue buttercream, but they absolutely can. And by the way, the reason why pasteurized egg whites don't whip up, or they whip up less efficiently with lower volume than raw egg whites, is because they are heat pasteurized. And that method entails holding raw egg whites at a certain temperature for a designated length of time, usually determined by the manufacturer, to kill all the pathogens inside so it's safe to consume. That temperature, however, is lower than the gelation or the setting temperature for the egg whites, which is why it's still liquid. It's still a heat treatment though, so it's enough to mess with the proteins such that they're unable to stick together and form that network and create the meringue. However, none of that even matters because we don't even need to aerate the meringue. And so in that case, I have an even better shortcut for frosting that I use all the time. So for this one, I take my pasteurized egg whites and pour it into a microwave safe bowl or measuring cup. I then add sugar and stir until dissolved. And then I microwave this on 20-second intervals, stirring between each heating step until all the sugar is dissolved. The important part now is to allow this mixture to cool down. And sometimes I'll place it in an ice water bath if I'm working straight through the recipe, and it'll be nice and cool by the time I need to use it. During that time, I whip the butter, add the powdered sugar, vanilla extract, and salt, and then I start to pour the cooled meringue syrup in 3 to 5 additions, mixing thoroughly after each addition. And the result for this is just as good as classic Swiss meringue buttercream. It's silky and creamy with great stability, not too sweet, and here I'm using it on my strawberry cake layers, and it was so easy to get a smooth texture on the outside of the cake. Okay, where are we at now? So we don't need an aerated meringue. We just need a nice whippy butter, which is, easy enough to make. And we don't even need to use raw eggs. I hope you're getting a sense of how I develop recipes, and that I get a basic understanding of a foundational recipe, in this case Swiss meringue buttercream, and then it elevates me to the innovation stage, and this is the fun part. So a couple of days ago, I was at the store and I grabbed some plant-based butter because some of you have been asking if I could try my hand at vegan desserts, which are notoriously difficult to create, at least for me. If I ever need humbling, I will attempt a vegan recipe. They're something else. Anyways, I thought that since I had a basic framework, I discussed earlier how the basis of a Swiss meringue buttercream is the meringue component and the butter component, and you just mash them together, right? I took the idea of the pasteurized egg whites. Instead, I used aquafaba from chickpeas and plant-based butter. And what you're seeing is my first attempt at doing this modification. And I did the same protocol. I added sugar to the liquid, which is the aquafaba, microwaved it until all of the sugar dissolved, cooled it, and then gradually added it to whipped plant-based butter that had been pre-conditioned with a bit of powdered sugar and vanilla. So I had a good feeling that this would work initially because aquafaba has somewhat of a similar characteristic with pasteurized egg whites in that although you can whip it up into a foam, it's usually not as lofty. Aquafaba has another constraint in that it's not highly stable as a foam by itself. Usually you have to add another component to retain its aerated state. So really it's the perfect substitution here since we don't need aeration. Of course, I was very skeptical of the final taste because I've never successfully made a vegan buttercream before that actually tasted good. But oh my goodness, it was great. Did it taste a little bit beany? Perhaps. But butter has a very complex taste. We source it from the mammary glands of another mammal, which is an interesting thing to think about. Beans, or aquafaba, which is the liquid drained from legumes, also have a very similar complex flavor. Initially, it was very difficult for me to pinpoint, so I had to let it percolate, and I let the frosting sit for a day, and I came back and I tasted it and I identified the flavor. And I know this is gonna sound strange, but the frosting tastes like how a donut shop smells in the morning. Yeah, I know. Now, to preface, this observation is coming from somebody who loves legumes. I try to eat them on a daily basis. I am on the Rancho Gordo bean waitlist, if you know, you know. But I haven't had time to thoroughly test this frosting for temperature and pressure stability. However, I will try to link that down below so that you can access an early version of the recipe. You have to solemnly swear that you're not gonna hold anything against me if it doesn't turn out. I'll give you a tester recipe, but I do think that it's good enough that I do want to give this to the vegan baking community. And it's worth a shot. Tell me if you like it. Tell me if it's awful. But yeah, now guess the flavor. What, does it have any other flavor?
Oh, no. Plant.
What do you mean, oh no?
Plant. Garbanzo?
Do you taste it?
No,
No, right?
Beans?